The wind came up from the river with a cold, iron smell, and the banners of House Lannister cracked like hides on the rack. Tyrion Lannister reined in his small, shaggy courser at the ring of cookfires and canvas that marked his father's camp. The night was full of hammering and men's talk. Low-throated, guarded, 100 tongues circling the same dread. War put a rasp on every voice. Sparks leapt from forges along the central lane where armorers banged dents out of breastplates and riveted splints anew. There was laughter from the women clustered in the lee of wagons. And overall, the reek of horse and leather and old grease clung to the air until it felt as thick as a pelt over the mouth. He could feel Bronn behind him without turning, the Sellsword's patience like a coiled strap, his gaze measuring each face with the flat curiosity of a butcher selecting a carcass. Tyrion smiled despite the cold. He had not thought to return to his father's tents alive. The Ares sky cells had been made for endings, not for beginnings. Yet here he was, in a red glow of coals and lion banners, in the shadow of a lord who had never wanted him. Men recognized him or pretended to, eyes dropping to the dwarf's legs and returning to his eyes with the practiced blink of men who had learned not to stare. A groom scurried to take their horses. Tyrion swung down and stretched his cramped back with a little groan he did not intend to give voice to. Bronn was the first to laugh, one sharp gust, hidden in his throat. "Try not to look so impressed," Tyrion told him. "It's only a few thousand men who would happily piss on us both." "Piss stinks less than the rest of this," Bronn said, taking his saddlebag as if it weighed nothing. "I'll find food. You find your father." A deep brass bell tolled at the heart of the camp, 3 measured strokes. The command tent loomed ahead, grander by far than any noble's pavilion had right to be. Its scarlet walls swelled like a fat man breathing, the pale lion stitched across so large that its claws had been cut and sewn separately. Guards stood outside, halberds crossed, with the stillness only perfect training gave to men. Their eyes tracked Tyrion like arrows. "Lord Tyrion," one said, unable to keep surprise from his voice. "Sometimes even we dwarfs are difficult to misplace," Tyrion said. "Is my father at table?" "In council." The guard hesitated, then lifted the flap. The heat inside was an animal of its own, panting against Tyrion's face. Tywin Lannister sat at the head of a long, low table littered with maps, wax seals, small painted blocks for cavalry and archers, a pewter dish of nuts no one had touched. Around him were faces the West had learned to fear or follow. Ser Adam Marbrand with his fox-bright hair, Lord Crakehall thick as a wine cask, Ser Kevin Lannister, measured and heavy-lidded, patience molded into human flesh. Others Tyrion knew better from rumor than acquaintance. They all turned and looked at him as if a dog had hobbled in and stood upon his hind legs to beg. "Father," Tyrion said, smiling. He had planned the smile. It was not as difficult as he had imagined. Tywin's eyes were a pale, clean green, the color of mint leaves crushed in winter. He did not stand. He did not speak at first. He looked at his son as a man looks at a stain found upon good cloth, then lifted his goblet and drank. Only when he had finished, when he might as well have been alone, did he set the cup down with the same measured care he gave to positioning soldiers upon a river map. "You were in the Eyrie," Tywin said. The slightest inflection made the question into a defect. "I was," Tyrion said cheerfully, "and I am no longer. The distinction is important to my continued interest in breathing." "Explain." Tyrion did, briefly. The road from the inn at the crossroads to Catelyn Stark's mad flight, the mockery of a trial piece by piece in the sky, the sick sweet air of the sky cell like old wine gone to rot, Bronn winning by letting a knight bleed himself out upon his own pride. He told it lightly as if telling it to a girl at a feast, without the cold dragging weight in his limbs that had been fear. He watched the faces around the table make their reckonings. Ser Kevin listened with a steady attention that felt like shelter in a high wind. His father did not interrupt. When Tyrion finished, there was a long quiet broken only by the soft hiss of the brazier and the distant clamor of a blacksmith cursing his apprentice. Tywin said, "You have embroiled us in war." Tyrion laughed. "I thought that honor belonged to Catelyn Stark. Or are we to pretend we have come here to fish? Some of the men smirked without permission. Tywin's gaze parched the tent. Our purposes are not served by your jests, Tywin said. We face an army to the east across the Green Fork, commanded by Lord Roose Bolton in the name of the boy Robb Stark. Jaime rides north. Our columns stretch thin along the river roads. You reappear with a cell's word and your tongue, and ask for applause. Only a cup of wine, Tyrion said, and a measure of courtesy that costs less than a spearhead. I have come, father, because I thought there might be some use for me. Use. Tywin let the word lie on the table, beside the pewter dish. You will ride with Ser Gregor's vanguard at dawn. The air came out of Tyrion as if someone had knocked the wind from him. Around the table, a few heads turned away, as if embarrassed on his behalf.
Ser Gregor, Tyrion repeated.
He thought of the mountain's shadow falling like thunder across men who broke under him the way furnaces break, consuming fuel and air alike. The vanguard, a meat grinder's mouth. His father had given him a death sentence and wrapped it in the language of honor and command. I am cunning, not tall, Tyrion said softly. My legs are not horses. No, Tywin said, they are not. But your mouth has galloped you where even horses fear to go. Perhaps the mountain will teach you the empty virtue of silence. Virtues are for septons, Tyrion said. His own voice sounded far away to him, small in that furnace heat, as if his words were a child's wooden sword tapping on a suit of steel. He swallowed, and found his smile had not abandoned him. It clung to his face like a scar. If I live, will you let me be of use then? If you live, Tywin said, we shall speak of it. He did not say more. He motioned with 2 fingers, and a servant refilled his goblet, and the map's river ran on. Tyrion understood. The lion had no time for the mouse he had set before the hawk. He bowed with excellent grace and left with the memory of his father's goblet rim wet as if it were a half-dried tear. Outside, the wind had grown meaner. Bronn stood beneath a cart, tearing meat from a greasy bone. Well, he said between bites, my father would like me to die in the morning, Tyrion said. He set the mountain to tutor me in obedience. Could be worse tutors, Bronn said. At least you know when you've displeased him. Tyrion took a strip of meat and chewed. The taste was dull as tallow. Men passed, laughing, wrapped in their own warmth and fear. Above them, the stars were iced points hammered into a blackenville. He could feel his father's green gaze in them, as if the sky itself looked down at him with measured contempt. He rubbed his thumbs together. The knuckles had grown tender in the airy from clutching stone and iron. In his mouth, the meat turned to ash. Bronn watched him. The Sellsword's eyes never moved hurriedly. They went about their business the way a cat prowls, unadorned and particular. Could be you don't ride with the vanguard, he said. My father has commanded it. Bronn shrugged. Men die. Plans change. The more it changes, the more I get paid. Cheer me with your devotion, Tyrion said. I'm devoted to coin, and to not being cut in half, Bronn said. He wiped his mouth on the back of his hand. You want to live, you think. Then you think like a man who wants to live. Tyrion looked at the tents where the cooks were stirring kettles of onion broth that would never stretch to the mouths that wanted them. He thought of the Ares dangling blue and the cold at his back like a tall cliff. He thought of his father's hand laying pieces upon the river map, indifferent to where the water ran. He thought of Tisha, and did not let her name form fully in the mind, only the ache of it, the way a missing tooth throbs when winter comes on. Men say a great lord must be made of stone. Stones are crushed under enough weight. There was a place in camp where men traded things the quartermasters would sniff at. Women's hair ribbons knotted around pocket knives, little works of brass, trinkets from Lys. A Lysini with eyes like drops of polished jet worked from a lacquered box the size of a child's coffin. He sold cinnamon there and saffron, and paper-thin sheets of gold leaf to lay over a roast capon's skin. There were other little bottles that were not for eating, Tyrion knew them by the care the man took with his fingers when he touched them. "You do not strike me as a man who samples his wares," Tyrion told him, turning a left-hand ring as if bored. A ring was armor in a camp like this. Anything that glinted persuaded men you were dangerous. "What would you give a lord who finds himself suddenly thirsty?" "My lord has wine," the man said lightly. "Not the kind I am thinking of." The Lyseni watched him a long while without blinking. Then he placed upon the box's black velvet one little vial no bigger than the last joint of Tyrion's thumb. Its glass was clear as river water. Its cork was sealed with wax darker than old blood. "This is a drop of nothing," the man said. He smiled with perfect teeth. 5 drops, and a heart forgets its work. 10, and a man might as well be a tree, save that trees do not go gray so quickly. It leaves no stain but the one the gods write on a man's face in time. "Poets should charge more and give less," Tyrion said. He set a velvet sack upon the table. The Lyseni weighed it by hand, then again with a small balance the weight's little frogs of brass. "You will want to pour it?" he asked. "I will want to forget it," Tyrion said. Bronn waited outside the lantern's circle. "You just paid a fat price for a small bottle," he said. "I paid to be bored by a foolish foreigner," Tyrion said. "Let us drink." They drank from a wineskin beneath the ribs of a wagon, watching boots pass between the spokes. Tyrion took only a mouthful, then another, and then he poured the third upon the frozen earth and watched it vanish. In his palm, the vial lay like the droplet the world had not chosen to make into a star. He could have walked away. He could have ridden in the morning beneath the mountain's banner and kept his head down and learned whether courage was a thing that could be taught like archery. He could have flung the vial into the brazier and watched the little pop as the wax sealed its own death. He slept instead, brief and badly. In his sleep, he dreamed of a long hall with no roof, and the stars above it were his father's buttons, and every button watched him. He woke before dawn and the camp's earliest stirrings, when the dark feels like an answer that has not yet heard the question. There was frost on the mouth of the water barrel. His breath came in little white puffs. He washed his face until it stung. The command tent was never empty, but it had its rhythms. Tyrion had noticed them the way rats notice the turning of a mill wheel. The cooks came early with porridge. The carpenters came late with requests. The guard shift changed when the sun's rim struck the top of a particular stripped poplar. Between the cook's steaming ewers and the first horns of the trumpets, there were 2 heartbeats when a servant cut and rewarmed the night's wine over the brazier to Tywin's liking. The boy with the jug was called Noel. He had a straw of hair that stuck out as if the cold had plucked him like a goose. Tyrion had pressed him a coin once for bringing a clean cup. It is amazing how quickly a boy becomes an ally for the price of a meat pie and a kind word. Noel's eyes went wide when he saw Tyrion waiting in the shadow of a rope. "Lord," he whispered. The tense light made him into a candle himself, all narrow and bent. "I took a liking for the temper of the morning wine," Tyrion said. "You wouldn't refuse a lord a taste while he waits to beg favor from his father." Noel blushed as if wine were a girl. He poured. The steam rose and brushed Tyrion's lip like a kiss. The boy turned to set the jug over the brazier again. "Have you ever seen a weasel?" Tyrion asked him. Noel blinked, startled at the oddity of the question. "Sly little beggars, steal hens, and they leave nothing behind but a feather," Tyrion said. "Do you know what the trick is?" "No, Lord. They make it seem the hen flew away of her own will," Tyrion said. When the boy laughed, the small bottle clicked against the jug's lip like a tiny bell. Clear nothing slid and vanished into garnet wine. The world did not change. The ground did not tilt. It was far too tidy to be fair. Tyrion thanked the boy and watched him go, his shoulders proud because a lord had spoken to him about weasels. He stood very still until the tent flap lifted and Tywin's voice spilled into the cold like hot oil. "My lord," Ser Kevin said. "Send word to Ser Gregor to rouse the vanguard," Tywin said. "We move at full light." The rest of the sentence he would never say. Tyrion did not flee. He did not even turn. He tasted, as if on the back of his tongue, the iron in the wind, the stale breath of the brazier, the memory of his father's voice speaking of a boy with a wolf at Winterfell. It struck him then that there are acts after which a man stands outside of himself, as if he were looking up from the bottom of a well at his own face. He found he did not much like the man at the rim, better than to move to do anything else. He walked out into the dawn. The trumpets woke the camp as if they were knives slicing canvas. Horses tossed their heads. Men cursed. The frost on the grass broke beneath their boots with a sound like breaking glass. Tyrion found Bronn by their horses with the saddlecloths already in place and a heel of bread in his teeth. "You look like you've swallowed a stone," Bronn said around the crust. "I have resolved to be obedient," Tyrion said. His hands shook only a little as he cinched the girth. The wind sobered him. He wondered if the poison in the jug was growing hot in his father's belly. He wondered how long it took a drop of nothing to find the heart in a man whose heart was armor. Perhaps nothing could not find its way through gold. They had ridden perhaps 15 minutes when the sound ran through the camp differently. Men's voices twisting together, the panic note that makes even bold horses show the whites of their eyes. The head of the lion had stumbled. Bronn cocked his head as if listening to a lark at dusk. He spat the bread into the grass. Hear that? The plans just changed. Tyrion did not urge his horse to a gallop. He could not make himself. He returned at an easy trot to the center lane and dismounted and handed his reins to a man he would not remember. He walked beneath the lion pelt of the command tent while men with hard mouths pressed past him. He forced himself to look because that is what he had bought the right to do. Tywin lay upon the carpet, one arm knocked aside, his hand upturned as if interrupting a point. His eyes were open. They were not green now, but a pale milky color like a thin glaze over pottery. The skin about his mouth had gone slack, and without the armor of his expression his face showed its age at last. A maester knelt at his side with fingers upon that terrible wrist that had moved kingdoms. He was speaking, my lords. The maester was babbling to no one. He was... And then the heart, I think. Sir Kevin was very calm. He looked very much like his brother and nothing like him at all. He sent men to hold the tent flaps and move back the curious and close the camp as if it were a purse. He looked at Tyrion the way one looks at smoke to be sure it is not a fire. Tyrion knelt. He could smell the wine. He will be purple, he thought absurdly. But there was no purple, only the gray creeping like frost over stone. He put his hand upon that dead hand. Felt like any hand. For a mad instant he wanted to lift it and put it over his own nose and mouth, to smother with what had smothered so many. "My lord," Tyrion said. He was surprised his voice obeyed him.
Ser Kevan.
"Will you command the host?" Kevin's gaze slid to him and away. "I will hold it together," he said, "until Lord Jaime returns." "From the Riverlands," Tyrion said. "You will wait for a brother who cannot be sent for, while Lord Bolton waits for you to hesitate." Kevin's jaw worked once like a man crushing a berry between his molars. "The men will see the banners," he said after the smallest pause. "They will fight for the lion, not the man. Take your place with the vanguard, Tyrion." "Of course," Tyrion said. "We must be obedient." He left the tent feeling the weight of his father still upon him, as though Tywin were a cloak thrown over his shoulders and pinned there by hands that would never move again. Outside, men spoke his father's name with awe and fear, and the syllables seemed suddenly foolish, like a password learned by rote whose meaning no one remembered. Bronn met him beside the horses and held out the reins like a priest at an altar. "Lord," Bronn said, "we ride to the front to learn if dragons were real after all." "Only lions," Tyrion said, "and wolves, and whatever Bolton is inside his skin." They rode into the morning as the sun thrust a blade between the trees and the river began to shine like something newly polished. Ser Gregor's banner flapped ahead, its black tower a smear. The ground was hard beneath the horses' hooves, each impact a hollow drum. Tyrion could not shake the sense that the world was thinner by one layer, as if a pelt had been stripped from it and cold now bled through. The battle at the Green Fork went off the rails by inches. Roose Bolton did not smash into the center as Tywin had expected. He drifted like mist along the bank, putting light troops where heavy would have been and heavy where light would have done. Without Tywin's chill sense for weight and measure, the Lannister lines moved in fits. Ser Kevan was no fool, but he was slower to guess where a river eats at its own bank beneath the surface. Ser Adam rode where he should, and men died as they always do, and the vanguard blundered into a stand of willows that hit a red bank soft as custard and lost 20 horses before they learned how to read the ground. The mountain did not teach silence. He taught men how to die loudly. Bolts went like musket hail. Someone blew a horn at the wrong time, and men to the left moved forward when they should have held, and Bronn's sword grew nicks like a comb gone too long without mending. Tyrion found himself laughing more than once because he could not stop it. The laughter came up out of him as if he had swallowed a stream that would not be kept. He did not die. The gods are indifferent. They miss their marks more often than one might expect. He killed a man with eyes as mild as a bridegroom's by driving the short axe that suited his height into the man's knee and then his throat. He kept near to Bronn because Bronn made a little pocket of survival around himself the way a blacksmith makes a circle of heat. When the horns finally called a retreat that was dignified enough not to be called. At a rout, Tyrion could not feel his hands. The mountain was drenched and grinning. He had learned nothing. None of them had. That night fires freckled the dark in a different pattern. The way stars alter subtly from one season to the next. Ser Kevan sent orders in a voice like sweeping sand. News came in knotted cords, drawn across, cut, retied. Jaime had ridden too swiftly and too clever and had been caught like a fish in the Whispering Wood. The boy Robb Stark had surprised the West. Ser Edmure Tully, whom Tywin had called a fool, had turned out to be not quite so foolish. Tyrion listened and chewed dry bread, and no one looked at him except to hand him a cup. The men said Lord Tywin had died of his heart as if it were a horse gone lame. The camp said this as if it made sense. Perhaps it did. Perhaps the gods, who missed their marks, occasionally toss one true. In King's Landing, word ran ahead of messengers as it always does, arriving on a cart of onions or in the dirty hem of a tavern wench's skirt. Cersei paced the Tower of the Hand and refused to sleep and drank her wine like a woman who had decided to drown and wanted to choose her lake. Her son sat his iron chair and fidgeted, and cut himself once on a badly filed barbed point, and swore to have the smith punished for it, and Cersei smiled with more teeth than welcome required. Pycelle warmed her with long words that floated like crumbs on soup. Varys spoke as he always did, as if there were a mouse pressed between his palms and he was determined not to crush it. Lord Tywin was a pillar, Varys murmured. Pillars keep things up. It is uncomfortable when they cease to do so. We have other pillars, Cersei said. Ser Kevan will hold the West. Littlefinger promises bread where there is no grain to bake. Joffrey will be obeyed. Bread will require grain, Varys said. But perhaps he means cake. Joffrey licked his blood away and hissed when it stung his tongue. I will have the Northman's head, he announced, careless of which Northman he meant. You will have what I give you, Cersei said smoothly. She took his cut hand and kissed it, and looked at Varys over the little king's well-combed hair with eyes that said, see, there is nothing I cannot make bend if I will it. Varys smiled like a man listening to a hymn he did not know the words to. Tyrion did not go to King's Landing. He remained with the host as it shrank inward, withdrawing via Harrenhal's black ribs to lick itself and fail to heal properly. Ser Kevan did what a sensible man can do when the floor tilts and the walls lean. He negotiated minor fealties. He crushed a few small heads. He wrote letters with one eye on the river for smudges of stark gray. He did not send for Tyrion save to ask how many men would desert if they were not paid this week, and what might be done if there was no coin to pay them. For that, Tyrion found coin. It was one of the things he had learned the way a man learns his own city in the dark, by walking it drunk. He told Kevan where to squeeze. He told him which gold cloaks could be bought for less than a barrel of salt herring. He told him what a man does when he doesn't want a dessert but hunger is asking him its questions and the belly answers more loudly than honor. And when Kevan listened, Tyrion felt the odd ache of gratitude like the first swallow of ale after a long drought. News came in pieces. Renly Baratheon had declared himself a king on a field of flowers and taken a bride with a smile like a raised visor. Stannis had declared himself a king without flowers and wed himself to iron. The riverlands burned with a wide, lazy fire that licked the eaves of barns and went to bed. In the Vale, the stone stayed where it always did, under its lady's watchful eye that flickered and went dark and flickered again. Tyrion considered this always with a small smile that did not reach his eyes. He had learned the Ares cold by memorizing it. It was difficult to forget. King's Landing sickened. Hungry men do not speak softly, and women with bellies do not sing. Littlefinger proved better at promising than producing. Cersei had gold, but gold has a way of being unwilling to turn itself into loaves if no one has planted wheat. Joffrey hunted men with a bow and returned with crows as if they were stags. The hound watched him with the face of a cracked idol. When the small folk spat, only once and very carefully, they made certain to spit when no gold cloak saw. The spittle steamed where it fell, so hot was the square with anger. Stannis' ships came around the arm as inevitable as Lent. Stannis never hurried. He simply arrived and expected the world to arrange itself to suit them both. He wrote letters that smelled of smoke and salt. He listed sins like an accountant balancing a column. He spoke of bastardy without inflection, as if naming the shape of a table. Cersei read him and laughed and tore the parchment. She had wildfire brewed in cellars that had not seen a broom since Maegor's builders had sealed them with their dead. It would burn, she said. It would burn those who thought to frighten a lion. "What is the plan for the river?" asked a cautious lord who had not lived long enough to know better than to ask. "The plan is to burn them," Cersei said. "Leave the walls to me." On the day Stannis' fleet showed black on the lip of the horizon, Sansa Stark stood in the Queen's presence and folded her hands, because hands distract the mind if you let them. There were other girls in the hall, seamstresses and kitchen maids and lordlings' daughters with hair plaited too tightly. But Sansa was the tall winter bloom among them, pale and carefully quiet. She had been learning the silences that keep a person alive. "You will come with me," Cersei said, smiling the way a sword smiles when it is freshly whetted. "We shall watch from the safety of Maegor's holdfast. The gods do not forsake lions, Lady Stark." Sansa dipped a graceful curtsy that her mother would have been proud of and her father would have recognized. She felt her father's last breath in her bones every time she moved, as if bones could be hollow flutes and grief blew through them. She thought of the boy king's hand on his bow and the way he had smiled when men flinched. She thought of the murmurs that rose from flea bottom like steam from stew that was mostly water. She thought, too, and was ashamed to think it, of how the dwarf had once looked at her and seen a person rather than a piece, without thinking his kindness was any protection worth counting. He was not here. He was somewhere to the west, beneath a lion's square of cloth. She imagined she could taste dust when she thought of him, the dust of roads and of words swallowed rather than spoken. Davos Seaworth stood upon the prow of a ship that was not his Black Betha. She was elsewhere in the line, and felt the wind come round his face like a hand that had forgotten it had ever been gentle. He had climbed a long way from the belly o' Dornishmen and onions in a little boat to stand shoulder to shoulder with captains who wore swords for their names. Stannis did not praise. He did not need to. The men who had followed him did not ask for sugar when they ate salt. They were here because truth was a hard stone and some men preferred stones to bread. "Keep her straight," Davos called, although his helmsman needed no telling. The river widened, and the walls loomed in their tired crowned nastiness, like a woman who has slept 3 hours and painted over it. Davos had brought ships into narrower guts than this. The taste of the wind changed and, with it, the taste of his mouth. Sour copper, old water over iron. He had been in battles enough to recognize when he was about to be asked to do a thing that was impossible and therefore necessary. There was no chain raised in the river. No boom waited like a hidden jaw. The alchemist's wildfire burned, yes. Green mouths blooming among the leading ships like a stranger's roses flung over a meal at a feast, but it burned without cunning. Cersei had not had the dwarf to sit astride the city with a book of plans and a tongue sharp enough to cut the fat away. She had wildfire, and the wildfire burned what it touched. It burned Lannister ships that blundered into their own trap as quickly as it burned Stannis' lead galley. It burned the little skiffs that were too slow to want to burn. It burned the men at the mud gate who were watching the wrong thing. Stannis came with ladders. He came with engines that smacked the walls as a fisherman smacks a table to loosen a stuck knife. He came the way winter comes, all together and all at once. The Hound did not flee the fires because there were fewer of them, but he hated them as much, and his hatred turned to a kind of perfect work. He killed men as if each were a candle he was extinguishing with a pinch of thumb and forefinger. But there were too many candles and too much wind. Within Maegor's holdfast, Cersei watched with her goblet in both hands and her smile drying at its corners. She had a little bottle of nightshade prepared by a timid old man who had never loved anyone but his own beard. She had resolved to be strong, and then she resolved to be stronger in her resolution. When the horns at the mud gate called differently, when shouts thickened, when the smoke rolled like a new wall that moved, Sansa felt Cersei's elbow brush hers like a woman jostled in a marketplace. She thought of going to the Godswood and asking for something from a tree that did not know her name. She stood instead and watched Stannis Baratheon's banner climb like a winter sun. Joffrey wanted to be brave. He had dreamed of it since he was old enough to understand that others had to do the dying for it to count. He stood upon the parapet until the first arrow came near enough to hiss by his ear, and then his courage evaporated like morning dew. Someone shrieked. It was a sound like a woman's, and it took Sansa a heartbeat to know it was her own. Men fought at the king's gate as if a gristmill had been set to grinding flesh instead of grain. The gold cloaks, some of them, opened a postern gate and let in men who wore neither crown nor lion, and so the city was lost. When Stannis took the throne, he did not sit immediately. He stood and looked at it as if it were a calculation he had done in his head 5 different ways and found the same answer each time. He ordered the bells rung for an hour. He had Cersei brought before him with her children. He declared them bastards in a voice that did not tremble. He did not smile when Joffrey spat at his boots. He had him taken away. Later, Davos heard in a dark corridor a muffled cry and a silence that felt like a door shutting. The city's rumor said a great many different things about that silence. The truth walked behind Stannis like a shadow and did not explain itself to gossips. Sansa went not to her brother but to the Tower of the Hand. That was no longer the Tower of the Hand, because men do foolish things when they are frightened and wiser things when they can. There were 100 arguments in council over what to do with her. Stannis wanted to hold her as surety. Davos argued for sending her to her family because that is what a decent man wishes for his daughters. The High Septon wished to pray while the city's bread ran low. It was Varys, with hands folded like a penitent's, who murmured, "Send her to her brother under safe conduct. The North is not one with iron alone." And so a raven flew, and when it returned its answer was written in Catelyn Stark's careworn hand and Robb Stark's newer, harder one beneath. Sansa went out accompanied by men in Stannis' colors and a banner with a direwolf stitched in soberer cloth than she had worn beneath one Lannister feast or another, and the city watched her go as if a part of its own heart were leaving. In the west, Ser Kevan studied the same map his brother had once touched. Tyrion had moved a little from the edges. He sat at the table more often and drank less during the meetings and more after them, which is one way a man tells the truth about himself without speaking. When the news reached them that King's Landing had gone, the tense breathing changed. You could feel men holding their air. Kevan did not rage like some lords. He did not throw cups. He folded his hands. "The Tyrells," he said. "Will they crown Renly's bride with a widow's veil and come to us? Will they go to Stannis? Will they sit in Highgarden and feast until they feel which way the wind is turning? They will send ravens to all 3 doors and eat while they wait for answers," Tyrion said. "They have learned their statecraft in a kitchen. They will choose the platter with the best smell and the least risk of bones. Littlefinger will go to them," Kevan mused. "He will whisper that a lion is not so fearsome once you've seen it on its back. Littlefinger will go where there is a chair nearer to a throne than the chair he currently occupies," Tyrion said. He has the gift of stepping over blood without getting it on his shoes. Can we expect him? Kevin asked. You can expect him to have remembered to blow out the candle before he left, Tyrion said. So that when he comes back, he can claim he saved us all from fire. Kevin's mouth twitched. It was as close to a laugh as he gave in those days. What do you advise, nephew? It was the first time he had said it that way. Not what do you think? Or perhaps you might. Tyrion looked at the old map and felt the way one feels a splinter working itself out, the absence of his father's hand upon it. He thought of coin and bread, and the ways men behave when they think the world is about to throw them off its back. He thought of Stannis, whose truth was a sword and not a song, and of Robb Stark, whose truth was a promise to his people that might yet be kept if no one tripped on it in the dark. He thought of Jaime in a cell and did not think of Tisha, and thought of his father dead with eyes like milk and knew that this was not something he could outrun, not by wine, nor by jokes, nor by buying a man to die in his place. We must talk to Stannis, he said. We must send someone who does not lie and cannot be tricked by his own words. He will respect a man he can despise less than he despises the rest of the world. Who? Kevin asked. Me, Tyrion said. Bronn stared at him later as if he had grown an extra eye. You mean to go to a man who burned his gods because he couldn't find a more convenient altar? I mean to go to a man who understands that wars end one of two ways. One man is dead or two men are tired, Tyrion said. He was sober enough that his hands were steady when he tied his saddlebags. He has won a city. He has not yet won a realm. We can help him win it if we are to be allowed to keep any of it. And why would you want to keep any of it? Bronn's tone was not scornful. It was simply curious, like a boy poking a beetle with a stick to see how it moves. Because it is my home, Tyrion said without thinking, and then, after a heartbeat, and because I would like to pay my debts. He rode east with a small escort, and the lion on his cloak turned inside out so that it showed plain red. He rode past villages that had been emptied as other men emptied a cup, easily and often. He rode past fields where bodies lay among harvest like a farmer's scythe had worked its will in both directions. He saw a woman in brown with a child at her breast, sitting on a doorstep and staring at the sun as if she were waiting for it to stop moving. He did not stop. He learned not to look too long at anything that could not be helped by looking. Stannis received him not in the throne room, but in a long cold chamber that had once been a feast hall and now craved bread it would not see again for some time. Davos stood to the king's left, as steadfast as a post set in a storm. Varys was not present. Littlefinger was not either. Tyrion found himself oddly grateful for that. He had the sense of having been given an audience by a windmill. Lord Tyrion, Stannis said. He did not say welcome. He did not offer a seat. He wore no crown. Perhaps that was wise, for no crown would have suited a head that seemed to resist adornment. He looked at men the way hounds look at a scent post, to learn only what they need and nothing more. Your Grace, Tyrion said, and bowed. He did not bow too low. You come to bend the knee? Stannis asked. Not mine, Tyrion said. My family's. Your father is dead, Stannis said, as if this were a rebuke. Which makes bending mine a curious form of necromancy, Tyrion said. I have come to speak about the West and coin and food. I have come because you have enemies enough for 3 kings, and I have no wish to feed any of them. Stannis's jaw worked, and he said nothing. Davos's eyes were clean as a wash deck. Say it plain, Davos suggested. Tyrion said it plain. He said that the West could feed the city at a price measured in less blood than starvation cost. He said that the Ironborn were stirring like weevils in a barrel of grain, and that if the West was reduced to howling, the Isles would come ashore like a black ooze and ruin what they could not use. He said that Robb Stark was a boy with a wolf's promise, and that he would die or he would not, but that it would be unwise to let the phrase hold the only bridge that mattered unchallenged. He said that the Lannisters had sinned and would be punished, and that if Stannis wished to be king in more than name, he must learn to harvest what his enemies would rather burn. Stannis listened with the patience of a man reading a list he did not make. You speak as if you were not of that house, he said at last. I have been of it all my life, Tyrion said. A man can describe his prison accurately without liking the bars. I will not ask you to love us, only to use us until you do not need to. You confess your house's crimes with ease, Stannis said. Men who do that are usually lying somewhere else while they pretend not to. My house's crimes are not shy, Tyrion said. They stand up in any light. Cersei will be confined, Stannis said. Your nephews and niece are bastards. They are children, Tyrion said before he could stop himself, and the word felt like stepping onto a stair that wasn't there. Do as the law asks you. I will not argue mercy to a man who counts the truth with pebbles. But perhaps remember that you were a child once. Something that was almost anger flickered behind Stannis' eyes and went out. Davos, he said instead. He wants you to be a king not only of swords, your grace, Davos said gently. He thinks to pay you for the privilege with grain. And with submission, Stannis said. Tyrion inclined his head. You do not need to hear me admit it to know it, but I will say it. If you bind the West to you with tolerable cords, we will not chew through them merely because our jaws itch. Will you bend the knee? Stannis asked again. To you, Tyrion said, and bent. He felt something tear in his chest when he did. He decided it was pride, and that this was no great loss. And I will bring Ser Kevin Lannister to kneel behind me if I am able to drag him on a rope. The agreement they reached had the shape of peace without its taste. Stannis would not style the Lannisters anything but vassals who had erred. They would not be destroyed if they fed the city through the winter. Cersei would be put to a trial of the faith when the faith had anything left of itself not eaten by hunger. In the meantime, she would sit in a comfortable room with a window that did not open and learn patience. Tommen and Myrcella would be placed with noble households who needed to be reminded daily of their loyalty to the crown. The gold cloaks would receive wages. The bakers would receive flour. The bakers' apprentices would stop throwing stones until the stones looked like bread. Robb Stark would be asked to treat with Stannis at Riverrun beneath guest right so thick no one would think to spill a cup. The Tyrells would be permitted to send their pretty girl to court with trunks of carnations and appleseed smiles. The Ironborn would be told not to test how far a king's reach extended along the Lannister coast. In short, the realm would be coaxed into a stasis that might have been called order by a less scrupulous tongue. When Tyrion left the audience, Davos walked with him to the door. You are not what I expected, Davos said. I try not to be, Tyrion said. You told him the truth and left your jokes where they belong, Davos said. In your head. I take them out and feed them sometimes at night, Tyrion said. Else they gnaw. Davos studied him with the same plain honesty that had made a king listen to a smuggler. You have a look like a man who has decided not to take a road he very much wanted to take, he observed. Tyrion thought of unspeaking bottles and cups, and of a boy who had laughed when a butcher's son cried, and of a father on the floor with a hand upturned as though he meant to catch a drop of rain he did not believe in. He said, I am exactly that man, and left it there. At Riverrun, the river ran broad and brown as always, and the trout upon Edmure's banners swam in place while the world stormed around them. Robb Stark had learned to keep his jaw still when crows circled. He had learned to speak as his father might have, without the false honey that sticks to a boy's tongue. Sansa came to him in a high room that smelled of rushes and remembered dinners, and when she saw him she nearly broke herself with the effort not to run like a child and wrap her arms round him. He set his hand upon her hair, and it was the first easy thing either of them had done in months. They took you, he said, his voice gravel and snow melt. They let me go, she said. It was not their gift to give. I took it. Catelyn held her in the night the way she had as a babe, palming the rise of her shoulder as if to remind herself that bones were still beneath that skin. When they spoke of King's Landing, Catelyn's voice thickened as if she had bread in her mouth and nothing to drink. They sent your sister north first, she said, and Sansa could hear the unsaid names crowding behind this one. Arya, Bran, Rickon, Jon. She is quicker on the road. She does not stay to make her bed. I hope she never does, Sansa said, and for the first time in too long she smiled without fearing it would break her face. Tyrion returned to the west with a parchment that made promises and implied threats in equal measure. Ser Kevan read it without moving his face. "You bent," he said. "I am surprised." "I did not break," Tyrion said. "You did something," Kevan conceded. He put the parchment down as if it might climb off the table on its own. "Cersei will spit. She will use her own bile to grease the floor if she can make someone slip. She will sit where she is set," Tyrion said, "or Stannis will burn the chair." He paused.
Ser Kevan.
"There is one thing I have not said." "Say it then," Kevan said, with the patience of a man waiting for a tooth to be pulled. "I killed him," Tyrion said. The words emerged as if pulled through a narrow opening. "Tywin, I arranged it. If you have a sword nearby, I would not ask you not to use it." Kevan did not reach for a sword. He did not even turn his head. He said, after a very long quiet, "I thought of it." "You did," Tyrion said harshly. "And you said nothing." He had expected many things. Rage perfumed with the incense of righteousness. The cool rebuke of a lord who thinks he has seen worse. Laughter. He had not expected the small noise that came out of Kevan then, as if a hinge had been oiled for the first time in a year. "I thought of it," Kevan said again. "I thought of it when I saw his face, when I saw the boy Noel staring as if he had seen a wolf in church, when I saw the jug half empty and the cup near at hand, and the way men spoke instantly of a heart that had never once admitted to beating. I thought of you. Then I thought of my own children." Tyrion braced for what must follow. "You will put me to a sword?" he asked lightly. Kevan shook his head. "I will tell you what your father would have told you," he said. "You did a thing. Now you will pay for it. You will pay for it every day until your last. You will not pay me. You will pay the realm by holding together what you can, by bending your cleverness to feed men who would prefer to gut you, by making peace where you can and making war where you must. That is the price. If you seek to pay a smaller one, I will take your head." Tyrion sat very still with his hands folded, and discovered that he was shaking. He put his hands flat upon the table to quiet them. "You are very like him," he said softly. Kevan's mouth tightened. "No," he said. "I am like myself. That is burden enough." They went to work. It is not a thing to sing of, the work of making a kingdom less apt to fall on its face when it tries to stand. It is lists and sums and the careful cutting of rotten planks out of a ship in motion. It is sending men with quiet mouths to the iron isles with gold and ugly promises. It is persuading bakers to take sawdust out of their flour and put pride back in. It is writing letters to Highgarden that smell subtly of peaches, and letters to the Eyrie that smell of stone, and letters to Dorne that smell of cool water and hiss. It is swallowing indignities like badly boned fish and pretending not to choke. The realm did not right itself. It did not fall entirely over either. Stannis held King's Landing with the chilly competence of a man who has accepted that this was not the work he had wanted but was the work at hand. Davos walked from granary to granary with his cap in his hands and got more done than any 6 lords put together because he spoke to men who baked bread as if a crown were no heavier than a sack of grain. Sansa wrote careful letters to the north from the warmth of Riverrun and learned to be patient with her own yearning as a seamstress is patient with a tangle of thread. Robb learned to let Edmure lose a battle he insisted upon winning and to win in other places while he did. The Tyrells came, carrying their roses and their calculation, and found Stannis less easily charmed than they would have preferred. They stayed because the smell of peace, even a bony peace, was better than hunger. The Ironborn raided and were beaten back and raided again, and were cozened with treaties that had the thickness of onion skin and were torn like it in due time. The Freys were watched at their bridge so closely that they grew tired of being watched. Walder's eyes went red and waterish, and he looked as if he had been forced to drink milk when he wanted wine. There was no red wedding. There were deaths, of course. War never forgets to collect. But no musician played a dirge at a feast that turned each spoon into a weapon. Roose Bolton waited patiently for someone to offer him his price and found, to his quiet rage, that no one would pay him in the coin he wanted. He learned to live with less. He wore it badly. Jaime Lannister came finally. Not in glory but in a rope-braced cart with his wrists bound and his mouth unruly as ever. Brienne of Tarth had a jaw set with a blacksmith's stubbornness and a presence like a sail on a day with too little wind. She brought him to King's Landing because Catelyn had asked her to end something rather than to begin it anew. Stannis received Jaime with the justice that had earned him a reputation like old iron. Jaime did not grovel. He did not apologize either. He laughed more than he should and less than he would have before a year in chains. He looked at Tyrion across a room in which men stood like furniture, and for a moment the years fell off them both. Two boys in Lannisport's alleys daring each other to jump higher from wharves that smelled of brine. "When did you learn to kneel?" Jaime asked him later, alone. "When I realized there was no cleverness in being killed by a king for the sake of a father who was not worth my breath," Tyrion said, and was surprised at his own certainty. Jaime's smile thinned. "He would be glad to see you holding the West's purse strings," he said. "He is beyond gladness," Tyrion said. He let the silence run a little. "I killed him." Jaime's head turned with a speed that made the candle's flame lean. For a heartbeat, the Kingslayer looked like a boy again, startled by everything because everything had been presented to him as if it were already his. Then he laughed once, not because anything was funny. "He killed himself a long time ago," Jaime said. "He just forgot to fall down." "Why?" Tyrion thought of Tisha, and for the first time in years, he let her name sit in his mouth without choking him. He did not speak it. He found he could not open that room yet. He was not sure he ever would. "Because I had no taste for being ground into paste beneath the mountain's heel to teach me the lesson of silence," he said. "Because I am a small man, and small men have sharp knives." "Because you wanted to hurt him," Jaime said, and there was neither accusation nor absolution in it, only the plain truth. "Yes," Tyrion said. They looked at one another a long while. "Thank you," Jaime said at last softly. "What an odd thing to say," Tyrion said. "He would have ruined us both to build himself taller," Jaime said. "He would have strapped me to that damn chair if he had thought it would keep it upright a day longer. Thank you for ending it on a floor rather than on your knees. May the gods forgive me if they keep the books so neatly. I do not think they take much care with their sums," Tyrion said. Jaime grinned then, crooked and golden. "I could keep my hand," he said. "Stannis likes a man to face him with what sins he has fully visible." "He will like you then," Tyrion said. "You are a walking confession." There were years after that. Few songs would have liked them. There were parliaments that lasted longer than sieges. There were markets where bread returned like an old lover looked at sideways. There were winters that came early and stayed late and bit like dogs. There were wildlings who came down out of the hard places and found, to their surprise, a king on the iron chair who took the North seriously enough to send him men and not just words. There was a wall and two boys named John up there and a man named Mormont, and ravens that flew with ice in their feathers. There were great shuddering rumors from beyond that marble of white, and Stannis went north sooner than another king would have done because Tyrion had stood in a cold place once and learned to be afraid of the wrong things. Tyrion did not marry Sansa Stark. He met her sometimes in halls where men gathered in fur and leather and put their hands on maps and tried to coax the future to stay where they pointed. She had grown into her face as a mason's work grows into an arch. The shape was inevitable and beautiful when seen whole. She had learned not to flinch when men raised their voices. She had learned to speak when it mattered. When she looked at Tyrion, she did not see a protector or a jailer or a jest. She saw a man who had chosen to be useful when he might have chosen to be something easier. "Thank you," she said to him once, when a levy of grain went to White Harbor without 3 different lords dipping their hands twice on the way, when a plague was stopped by closing a road for 1 week and not by looking for a witch. She did not say what for. He nodded as if she had praised him for writing neatly. He did not stop drinking. He did not stop joking either. Men are not plows to be turned from one furrow and expect them to run straight in another. He grew older. He grew heavier in the face. He learned to sleep a little. He learned that guilt does not disappear. It simply finds a shelf at the back of a room and collects dust between episodes of throwing itself down and demanding to be noticed. He dusted it sometimes, as one does with an heirloom one cannot display and cannot sell. Ser Kevin died not in battle, but in his bed with a draft beside him. He had grown tired of making lists. He left them to Tyrion without a word. He left him also a single ring, plain, a band of gold without device. When Tyrion slid it on a finger that had never been claimed by anything but ink, he felt the weight of the West upon it and found it tolerable. Once, in a narrow summer, Tyrion rode alone in the early morning along a low cliff that looked out upon the sea. The water was a flat sheet hammered to a chill shine. The wind off it slid under his cloak and out again, efficient as a well-trained servant. He stopped his horse without meaning to and dismounted because the need to be standing was suddenly too much for a man to bear in the saddle. He stood and he said, "Father," to the empty air, and found that it did not choke him. He said it again, and then, for the first time in a long time, he said, "Tisha," and the name did not break him either. He felt how the two names sat upon his tongue like stones, different in shape but equally real. He did not ask forgiveness. He did not give it. He looked at the line where sea met sky and thought, with a steadiness that surprised him, that there are worse prisons than duty, and that some men put themselves into them because the alternative is to be a stranger everywhere. He turned and rode back to the work. In King's Landing that year, an orange tree in the Red Keep's garden bore fruit. It was absurd. Its leaves too eager, its fruit too bright for that place of old stones and older grievances. But it bore. Davos ate one and said it tasted like a promise that would not be kept and was worth biting anyway. Stannis did not eat one. He passed the tree each day without seeing it. He had other fruit to count, bitter ones, the kind kings must choke down. Tyrion laughed when he heard of it. "We are becoming extravagant," he told Bronn, who had stubbornly refused to die and now had lands the size of a mean man's greed and a seat at a table where knives were used mostly for meat. "You say that as if it were a bad thing," Bronn said. "I like oranges. I like meat more." "Men like you do," Tyrion said. "Men like you too," Bronn said. "They just like to pretend they don't, till they need bread or a lie." Tyrion raised his cup. It held wine like a captured sunset. He drank and tasted, for once, only what was in the cup and not what the cup reminded him of. The work waited. It always did. He set the cup down and went to it because that is what one does after one has chosen his prison. He had put himself in it with his own sharp little hands, and he would build shelves upon its walls and hang maps on them in place, carefully, in a very particular spot where he could reach it when he must, a small bottle full of nothing at all. The mines ran like veins into the red rock, and the hammers echoed down them in steady pulses that reminded Tyrion of heartbeats counting time toward an appointment a man would prefer to miss. At the mouth of one, a foreman with whiskers stiff as brush bristles stood with his cap in his hands, as if the cap might be persuaded to answer questions more usefully than the man who wore it. The carts came slower these days. You could see it in the way the boys in back put their shoulders to the wheels, less swagger, more lean. When Tyrion asked why, the foreman's eyes slid toward the cliff face where the old galleries had been abandoned. "Bad rock, my lord," the man muttered. "She's gone crumbly." "She," Tyrion said pleasantly, as if they were gossiping over a dice throw. "The rock is a she? She's a bitch, my lord," the foreman said, galvanized into honesty by fear of laughter. Tyrion did not laugh. He walked to the edge and peered down into the dark where men toiled with lamps hooded half against gas and half against superstition. The West had built itself on metal. Red for the banners, yellow for the sun through coin, dull iron for the hands that broke both out of the earth. Men in the city thought gold grew like grapes in little tight bunches. Men in the rock knew better. Gold was a stubborn suggestion in stone, coaxed rather than found. "What's the truth?" Tyrion said to the master of mines when they were alone in a narrow office that smelled of lamp oil and fear. "The truth is we have eaten the fattest part of the feast," the man said, and wiped his forehead with a rag he had not bothered to launder. "There's meat on the bones yet, but we will need more knives and men to cut it clean. New shafts, new supports, time. If I had my pick of the gods, I'd ask the smith to stand a week with us. Failing that, I'll ask you for coin." "You may ask," Tyrion said. And because I am soft where I should be hard, you may have it. He thought of the great ledger in Lannisport that stretched like an old river across pages yellowing at the corners. He thought of bales stamped with the Reach's sheaves and barrels with Storm's End branded into their sides, the silent language of trade. In return, I will have your oath that you will put no man into a kraal that will collapse over him simply because his wife is pretty. I swear, the man said, a little shaken at being seen so neatly. Do not swear to the gods, Tyrion added. Swear to me, I am quicker. He left the mines to the sound of picks and trudged up the lane toward where the river widened into the sea, gulls carving white letters in the air that spelled nothing. Ships lay at anchor just outside Lannisport's harbor mouth like patient cattle. He had made their patience possible these last years by learning to feed them. The decks had the look of places that had been scrubbed of sickness lately. He preferred that to the look of places that had not. Letters waited for him in a satchel tied with 3 strings and sealed in wax with 3 different devices. It had not been opened on the road. He slid it with the tip of a knife and read standing, letting the sea wind dry the sweat under his hair. Davos wrote a hand as plain as the man. Upright strokes, sensible loops, the rare blot apologized for in a margin with a word that had something of a smile in it. Stannis was readying for the north, he wrote, because the White Ravens had flown from Old Town, and when winter was named a thing's true name in that fashion, men ignored it at their peril. Provisions were needed, sledges and nails, fur and salt beef. The city could bear it barely. The West had more and must be his arm, as promised. He added a line at the end that might have been an afterthought if Tyrion had not known what it cost Davos to tack on any word not strictly necessary. I hope you are well. Another letter was in an angular hand that bit the page harder than ink should bite. Robb Stark intended to come south to Riverrun, for the rivers needed tending, and he would be glad to receive any who came under peace. Catelyn Stark's marginal note softened it with courtesy. Sansa's steadied the whole. There was grace in her script now, a ripening he had guessed at in the quickness of her eyes the last time they met among maps and bread and the smell of horse. He touched her name with a thumb and left no smear. The ink had dried and the world with it, a little. The last letter bore the son of Sunspear impressed into yellow wax. Prince Doran's script was neat and patient. Ash. E was content with the arrangement regarding Myrcella, it said, and would see it honored so long as the king's peace held. He remained, as ever, a loyal friend to Prudence. That was as close as Doran Martell ever came to telling a man he had done well. Lord? The harbor master said carefully in his ear, as if interrupting a man had a weight to it. Send 3 empty-bellied cogs up coast, Tyrion said. The granaries at Case and Fair Isle are to be half-emptied to feed men who will spend their bodies in frost instead of fire. Put labels on the crates in letters big enough that even a gold cloak can read them. Starve here last. It helps to remind them. The harbor master grinned despite himself. He rode for King's Landing 2 dawns after, with a light escort and a heavier ledger, and Bronn humming a tune that had been old when Harren built his folly. The river roads were rutted but passable. Men at the inns looked up with quiet interest and then returned to their bread. War had taught them to conserve their eyes as well as their food. The city smelled like itself, tar and fish and old urine and ambition. The red keep shone a tired red in the sun, as if it had been polished more to please some new master than because it would hold a better shine. Davos met him in a cool chamber near the Queen's old apartments. His hair grayer at the temples, the lines around his mouth cut deeper as if he had smiled and frowned at close intervals and both expressions had decided to stay. You look like a man who has been reading sums by candlelight, Tyrion said. I am a man who has been watching baker's scales, Davos said. I would rather be counting sales. You will be soon enough, Tyrion said. I have brought you nails and coin and promises with signatures you can collect on. Good, Davos said simply. Stannis leaves within a fortnight. He will go to the Wall by sea. The land is too slow now. Pylus says the White Ravens were fat, Tyrion said. My maesters say that is how Old Town announces the measure of the cold. Pylus says a great many things. Davos said in a way that made it fondness rather than dismissal. He is very sure of how the past has always behaved. And you? Tyrion asked. How sure are you of the future? Davos looked out the narrow window where the city's roofs lay like a field of tiles. Not at all, he said. But I am sure of this, hungry men will listen to any priest. We have fed them. That will make the priests work harder. He poured wine, plain and red as a cut. Tyrion took it, and they spoke of wagons and coopers, salt and the rate at which mules died when they were asked to do men's penance. They spoke of the Tyrells, who sent another convoy with flowers tied to the first cart that would be fed to goats before the day was out unless Bronn skewered them with a look. They spoke of the Hightowers, whose bells had rung night and day when the white birds flew, and of Doran Martell's endless patience, which would one day, like any well, either dry up or flood its banks. And the Queen? Tyrion asked finally, when the ink had dried and nothing remained but the stain on his fingertips. In the Great September, Davos said, the High Septon is a careful man. He wants very much to be the one to put down a wolf's head if the Seven give him leave to try. He is less eager to break a lioness's teeth, but he will do it. Stannis made him understand that law does not bend for a woman any more than a ladder bends for a man who is too proud to duck. Cersei was never fond of ladders, Tyrion said. You will see her? Davos asked, watching Tyrion not as a lord watches a lesser man, but as one sailor watches another when there is a squall to windward and both are deciding whether to reef. I will, Tyrion said, and let the word stand. The Great September of Baelor had a quiet during the day that felt artificial, like silence in a theater between scenes, the set being changed behind draperies by men who breathed too loudly. The pillars rose, pale and high, and the light through the colored glass fell like thin cloth on the floor, slashed where swords had once been drawn. A small company of women moved silently around a fountain. The Queen's face was thinner than it had been, the great beauty altered by the way hunger marks a woman's bones, not pinched as it pinches the poor, but refined past the point of comfort, like a blade sharpened once too often. She wore gray with no jewels. The color fought her and lost, as color always had. My little brother, she said, and the voice was a bomb poured over a blade, hiding its edge long enough to coax a man nearer. Do you bring my father with you? You will find him everywhere you look, Tyrion said, which was the nearest he had ever come to telling her the truth. You have his eyes today, she said, and it was almost an observation, and then the smile turned and showed teeth. No. His weasel sons. Has Stannis taught you to kneel as well as you taught him to count? The city has eaten this week, Tyrion said. We both should kneel for that. If you will, I will. She laughed. The sound bounced off stone and glass as if startled to find a wall so close. They say I am to confess, she said. They say I am to confess to the sin the city likes to sniff at as if it were a pie in a window. I am to be paraded, perhaps. There will be cloth laid for my feet. Will you come and watch me walk? I have better entertainments, Tyrion said, because to be kind to Cersei was to hand her a rope and your own throat. Tell me where Tommen is happy. Happy? She repeated, tasting the word as if it were a foreign spice. Do you know, when he was very small, he would carry the kittens to bed with him and was astonished when they pissed on him? He thought the world could not but love him. It is a dangerous mistake. You should not have allowed it in a child. He is in Old Town. He writes me letters about the scent of water under the high tower. He will live, Tyrion said. He will live to despise you all, Cersei said softly, and her eyes shone with something too complicated to name. Whatever happens to me, you will have made another enemy for yourself, brother. You always do. I do not keep them, Tyrion said. They keep me. They keep you alive, she said, because killing you would be too quick for the sort of revenge anyone clever wants. I think of it sometimes. I confess that. In the High Septon's manner, with my eyes lowered. I think of you trying to drink wine and finding vinegar. I think of you sitting in my chair in our father's house and being unable to reach the floor with your feet. I think of you and the little singer you bedded losing your taste for each other when the nights got colder. Shay, Tyrion said to himself, auditioning the name and setting it aside. Careful, sister. Your confession is peeking out of its shift. She stood and came closer, the gray fabric whispering, the scent of subtle powder about her. Did you do it? She whispered. With a knife and his bowels and his glare like a god's? Did you hand him his end because he handed you a sword and told you to hold it by the edge? No, Tyrion said. There was more truth in it than he could have explained to anyone, least of all to her. He died of a heart that had spent itself in disdain. Then that is a pity, she said, and turned away, the line of her neck a delicate sculpture of pride and hunger. Because if you had done it, I might almost have forgiven you. A whisper rolled along the outer aisles of the September like wind moving in wheat. The High Septon entered with his attendants, and their faces had the mild righteousness of men who truly believe that their thumbs never smell of onion. The trial would be tomorrow. Tyrion inclined his head to his sister as if they had parted friends after a shared music and left, because there are moments when the only courtesy left to a man is to be elsewhere. Outside, the hill sloped down toward the mud gate, and the river lay broad and brown beyond it. Varys found him before he had gone 50 paces, appearing as always in the place where a man's thoughts are about to change direction, like a guide who has made a study of crossroads. The eunuch's robe rustled, fine as dry leaves. His hands were folded, his smile painted lightly upon his face and able to be washed off with water. Lord Tyrion, he murmured, you smell of mines and bread, an intoxicating combination. I am mixing a new perfume, Tyrion said. It will be all the rage among men who wish to smell like work. Work is unfashionable, Varys said, unless it is the sort that can be pointed to from a window while drinking wine. Tell me, did the queen offer you her love? She offered me the memory of kittens, Tyrion said. It is the kind of tenderness that keeps a man awake when he would rather sleep. The city will sleep better soon, Varys said, and his eyes slid toward the September. Law is a strong pillow. If you are sure of yours, Tyrion said. I sleep without dreams, Varys said. It is one of the benefits of being a small man in the place that matters. You are not so small, Tyrion said. Only where it counts, Varys said, and so neatly closed the subject that Tyrion had to grin. The trial was a succession of precise humiliations dressed as solemnities. The High Septon's voice filled the nave, and witnesses stepped forward to say what they had heard, and what they had wanted to hear, and what they had been paid to say and now said for free. A boy cried. A woman fainted with decorum. When Cersei spoke, her voice was low and music, and it broke only where it would be most moving. The godly found it insufficient. Stannis had made clear that the city's old habit of mistaking power for innocence had been broken. When judgment came, it was in words that had rolled the dust of centuries between their syllables. Confinement at the mother house on Visenya's hill until the faith should deem her cleansed of her sins. There was to be no walk. There was to be no spectacle. Stannis did not confuse law with entertainment. The city gossiped less than it would have done if there had been breasts to point at. Cersei vanished into cool stone and candle smoke like a song hummed under the breath until even the person humming could not hear it. Merciful, Davos said, and did not sound entirely pleased. Legal, Tyrion answered, which is something Stannis prefers to mercy when he can manage it. When he cannot? Davos asked. Then he manages the opposite, Tyrion said. Jaime's arrival at the Red Keep was less of an event than it had once seemed it must be. He came on a black gelding with a piece missing from one ear, his wrists unbound, his hair sun-faded, his mouth in its old unconquerable curve as if he had fallen into the shape the gods had whittled for him and relearned the trick of wearing it. Brienne rode beside him, blue and battered and honorable to a fault that made the city's less noble souls want to prod it with sticks to see if it would yield. Stannis saw them in the same chilly chamber where he had seen Tyrion weeks earlier, and heard what there was to hear with the economy of a man paying by the word. I was sworn to a madman, Jaime said, uninvited into honesty. I killed him to save a city that has not remembered the favor for a day since. You swore one oath and kept another, Stannis said. A man can do only that. You are no longer a Kingsguard. Jaime's eyebrows lifted. Am I dishonored? You are freed of a service you were not suited to, Stannis said. You may seek honor somewhere. You do not think the cloak will do the work for you. You could have put that speech in fewer words, Tyrion said later as they walked along a gallery open to the river air. Would you prefer he had had me flogged? Jaime asked. He looked at the city with an expression that was not quite fondness and not quite contempt. I will take the Stormlands. There are holdfasts unkept and lords who think the king's law is an idea. I can crush ideas when they put men into rags. You will need to learn not to bed their wives, Tyrion said. I learned that lesson a little late, Jaime said, and his mouth moved, and the expression it made was new. Brienne went north with a letter from Catelyn Stark tied into her gauntlet, and the weight of it was visible in the way she sat her saddle. She had delivered the Kingslayer as asked. There was still a girl promised to her keeping, though not now kept by those she had thought would harm her. Men who watched her go said she looked like a ship bound for a port that would have her only if she proved herself in 10 different kinds of weather. She left nonetheless, because that is what one does with oaths when one is Brienne of Tarth. When the White Ravens finally arrived in King's Landing, the bells of the Great September rang flat and tireless for a day and a night together, and a clerk in the counting house of the Master of Coin drew a line across a page under the summer column and began writing beneath winter in a hand less neat than before. Stannis took ship for the Wall. Celis went with him, and Shireen, and Melisandre, whose red hair made a wound in the air when the wind took it. Davos kissed his wife and sons, and his hand lingered upon the boy's hair a moment longer than was usual for a man who is honest about how fast he hopes children grow. Tyrion watched from the quay, his cloak pulled close against a wind that might have been the harbor's whim or might have been the north exhaling. Stannis raised a hand that was not a wave and not a farewell and disappeared into the business of masts and rope. The ships were better than they would have been a year earlier. Nails set true, cakes hard as stones for the crew, and slightly less hard for the knights. Cloaks with fur at the collars that would not molt in the first weather. There are victories that make no noise. Tyrion had learned to count them by touching them. He went north by road weeks later, because there is a difference between managing bread with a quill and seeing the sort of hunger the cold writes on men. The King's Road had been patched where armies had kicked holes in it. Inns that had once poured watery ale in generous measure now measured it like coin. He stopped at Queen's Crown and ran a hand along the leaning tower's old stones with its moss like old fur. The river there had a skin of ice at its edges and grumbled under it, an animal not yet fully woken. At Castle Black, the walls were white with powder that did not melt under a brief sun. The men of the watch had the look of men who had learned to expect less food for more labor and had decided it was a fair rate if measured against being alive. Tyrion found Jon Snow older by hard increments rather than years. A line here, an oldness at the corner of an eye there. He wore command like a cloak that had been cut for a larger man. He held it closed at the throat and kept moving. Ghost padded at his heel as if winter itself had taken an interest in guard duty. You remember me? Jon said, surprise under control. I remember a boy who looked at the wall and saw it all at once, Tyrion said. He is still there in your face somewhere. And you? Jon asked. I remember a dwarf who bragged to a boy that he knew more than he did, Tyrion said. I am still here in mine. They stood a while, saying nothing, because sometimes a silence is the only honest souvenir men can exchange. Stannis' encampment smoked on the lee side of the wall. The king's standard snapped, plain and hard. Melisandre's red showed here and there like embers that dared not go out. The wildlings huddled beyond. Mance Rayder's great ungainly host unkinged and disassembled and invited to live if it would learn to be small at last. Tormund Giantsbane laughed like a man who had made peace with the idea that someone else might survive him. Shireen stood upon a drift of packed snow, stiff in a plain wool cloak, her cheeks pinked. She read to a boy with hair like crow's wings from a book whose spine had been mended twice. Davos watched them, a little removed, his hat in his hands despite the cold as if respect warmed him. Celis' mouth was drawn, but it always was. Perhaps this was what happened to a woman who tried to be a sword for a man who wanted an anvil. Your Grace, Tyrion said to Stannis when they stood in a tent that might as well have been any tent in any army, save that a map of the wall and the lands beyond lay spread like a cut animal upon the table. "Lannister," Stannis said. He did not offer wine. There was none beyond what had already been counted. "I hear you have fed my men more than once on their way north. I hear you have failed to cheat very many bakers." "I am improving," Tyrion said. "It is cold. It is honest," Stannis said. "Tell your western lords that if they wish to be forgiven for a great many things, they may send furs and salted meat and smiths to make spearheads from old plowshares. It is not a thing a bard will sing of. I will know who does it nonetheless." "They will do it," Tyrion said with a conviction that surprised him. "Not because they love you, because they have learned to hate hunger a little more than pride." "And you?" Melisandre asked, entering as if the tent had been waiting for her to finish the scene. The air moved with her as it does with fire, uncertain of its obligations. Her eyes found Tyrion as if she smelled something honeyed on him. "What do you hate, small lion?" "Being wrong," Tyrion said. "You were wrong once," she said, smiling, and the smile had teeth you could not see. "In the dark, you thought no one saw you, but the Lord of Light sees all deeds done under sun and under stone." "He has poor taste in entertainment," Tyrion said, and Jon looked at him over the rim of a cup, understanding more than he had let show. "Leave him," Stannis said to her without looking, and she departed because he had said so, which is one measure of a king. In the weeks that followed, the wall learned to welcome and detest the king in equal measure. Stannis set men to work with a ferocity that warmed them. He listened to Jon in a way that made men grumble and work nonetheless. He took Mance's people in and set them under rules. Tyrion met Samwell Tarly, who blushed and stumbled in his words and then stood up in them like a man with his sea legs when he spoke of the others and the dragonglass, the way it bit and broke. He found himself writing, nights by poor light, letters with more urgency than any coin tally had ever had, to Old Town for books and blades, to High Garden for grain, to Winterfell, which was intact and stubborn, for men who knew snow as a tool and not an enemy, to Dragonstone to fetch more of the black glass that had been lain there some time before any of them had been born. On a night when the northern lights wrote their own letters across the sky in green fire, Tyrion stood on the top of the wall with Jon and drank something that called itself ale and would have embarrassed the name under any other roof. "You are wearing that cloak like it fits you now," Tyrion said. "I am wearing the man who wore it last," Jon said simply. "The dead demand rents in sorrow," Tyrion said. "Some men can afford the house." He did not stay to see the first of the others in their own white cruelty come and test the new law. That belonged to other men, and he knew it. He went south again with pages full of numbers and the taste of cold under his tongue. He stopped at Winterfell not because he had to, but because something in him that had been young on his first journey north wanted to see it. The walls were the same, grayer with smoke, perhaps, but stout. The Godswood's trees breathed old secrets into air you could see. Robb met him in the yard, Catelyn at his side, and the boy he had been was carved out of him now, leaving a man whose laugh had learned the discipline of rare appearance. Grey Wind lay with his head on his paws like stone turned into muscle. "The North remembers," Robb said, and it was not a threat or a boast, simply the truth of the place laid out among other truths like wood stacked for winter. "It forgets nothing worth keeping," Tyrion said. They walked under the trees and spoke of Stannis and laws and how much pride costs when winter sells necessities dear. Catelyn watched them both with that mother's look that takes the measure of what harms and what heals like a maester. Sansa came to them like a pale flame among the evergreens. Her hair had deepened. Her eyes had not grown hard. He was almost embarrassed to be relieved of that. She took his hand with warmth that went to his shoulder and said nothing that would make a courtesy sound like a debt. Later, alone with her by the pool where the heart tree's red leaves lay like tongues, he said, "You look well. I have learned where to put my eyes," she said. "There is less ugliness in a Godswood than in a hall. You will have to learn the hall again," he said. "It is a woman's lot to live under roofs and watch the way men set beams." "It will not be the same hall," she said. Her mouth quirked. There will be men in it who listen. More than one, Tyrion asked, incredulous. 2, perhaps, on holy days, she said gravely, and he laughed and could not help it. He made a gift he had been saving, then, wrapped in linen and absurd given the cold and the lack of color in all their lives. A little carved lion, no bigger than a woman's thumb joint, its mane done with care. A toy any child would have loved for the way it fit a pocket. She turned it, and then, without speaking, set it in a niche in the god's wood where the bark made a hollow and leaves would hide it, and left it there. When she looked at him again, what was there in her face needed no words. When he reached King's Landing, trouble had arrived by other roads. The Ironborn had taken to ships like rats, and a man named Euron had come back from whatever black god had kissed him and set a crown of driftwood on his head. The shields had been raided. Old Town's harbor had seen fire on the water. The red wines had put out as if the sea were wine they meant to skim. The Tyrells sent a letter that smelled of roses and blood, as everything that grew in that house did when you pressed it, and asked for help in the manner rich men request a loan they mean to control. "We will give them ships," Tyrion told Davos, "not because the Reach cannot build its own, but because men are more grateful for what they cannot do than for what they can. And because it will keep Paxter honest." "I like Paxter," Davos said. "So do I," Tyrion said, "which is why I prefer to keep his accounts open on my desk rather than closed on his." They held council with Garland Tyrell, whose sober mind was a pleasant surprise in a house that so often mistook charm for wit. Garland spoke of currents and tides without preening. He listened to Davos as if listening were a skill he enjoyed. Olenna, when she deigned to be present, skewered 3 plans in as many breaths and left the room with the air of a gardener who has pruned a vine negligently and improved it by accident. "Where is Peter?" Tyrion asked Varys afterward, as if asking after a missing spoon and not a serpent. "In the Vale," Varys said mildly. "He has married, made a widow, made a lord, made a boy shake, and made a plan. It is remarkable how much making one man can accomplish." "Lisa," Tyrion said, "and Robert." "Lady Lisa fell through the moon door," Varys said, and made it sound like clumsiness rather than murder. "The boy is weak. The Lord's declarant hold Peter on a leash he pretends is a ribbon." "And Sansa?" Tyrion said before he could measure the risk of showing it mattered. "In Winterfell," Varys said, "where she should be, perhaps, for once." The Ironborn were not stopped by letters. They were stopped by ships that knew where to go and when to turn in narrow channels, by men who understood that the best way to fight a pirate is to deny him the sight of your fear. Euron's silence sent back no drums to answer, and the man himself stayed out beyond the line where honest water ends. He threw a priest into the sea with chains about him and called it a sacrifice. The gods said nothing. That, Tyrion thought, is often their most eloquent reply. When the White Harbor Fleet and the Red Wine Fleet at last boxed the Ironborn into a corner of sea that had no corners, the ships of the West came in from the side like patient hounds closing on a boar. Bronn took an arrow out of his arm and spat and called the archer a goat and kept on. Davos stood upon the forecastle of a ship that was not the Black Betha and thought perhaps this was the debt he paid for living long enough to put his own boat to bed. Tyrion watched from the quayside at Old Town as pieces of mast and men washed up separately and resolved not to let the taste of victory trick him into believing the world had become simple. On a day when the sky lowered like lid of lead over a pot, a rider from King's Landing brought fresh news to Old Town. Cersei had taken vows with the mother, and her hair had been shorn under a veil. Celis had sailed north and had not returned with the king. The child Shireen had laughed in snow. And the High Septon had delivered a sermon about the evils of false gods that had not mentioned Melisandre by name and had everyone present looking at their own shoes. It was later still that the first true news of the others came. Not rumor, not a hunter's tale told with too much ale aboard. A raven in Jon's hand, the letters crooked where the bird had been too cold to want to stand. There were things walking in the woods that no fire longed to warm. There were men who had gone out and come back wrong. There were children lost and found and made to lie down in the snow as if the snow had always meant them to lie there. There were whispers in the ice of a king with no breath and a crown of knives. The words did not say Night's King. That was an old name from a story that always felt as if it wanted to crawl inside a new man and make itself comfortable. The word said only, "We must have steel. We must have fire. We must have men who do not run from cold. Send dragonglass. Send words. Send anything that is not prayers." Tyrion took the letter to Davos, and they took it to Stannis' small council, and then they took it to the city in the only way a city likes to receive truth, in slices, thin and salted, that men can set upon bread without choking. Varys murmured that Bravos had ships, and Tyrion said to hire them. Garland Tyrell might have laughed at another time. He did not now. He wrote to Willis about horses that would not die at first sight of snow. The High Septon shut his mouth on the line where he had meant to say something about the gods protecting their own, and instead spoke of charity in a voice that made charity sound like a discipline. By then, the dragons were no longer a rumor from the other side of the world. Dany Targaryen had made herself a queen of cats and smoke in a city of bells and bargained with men who mistook her kindness for weakness and been taught that kindness is a blade a woman must learn to conceal inside a loaf. She sat in Meereen and tried to make a broken will turn without catching her skirts and breaking herself, and there were men in Westeros who watched her from the corners of their eyes while talking about other things. Varys had never quite stopped singing one song quietly while humming another loudly. Now he listened. Tyrion did not go to Essos as he had once done in a different set of days. His feet were tied to a different hearth, and his hands to other ledgers. But he read accounts that made his skin prickle, of a girl with silver hair and 3 breaths of fire that called themselves beasts, and he thought, privately and without telling even his wine, that the cold creeping downward from the top of the world might welcome a little flame. At Riverrun, the lords came and went like a tide in a narrow bay, each leaving something. Salt on the stones, fish scales on the steps. Edmure learned to keep his mouth shut when men he had grown up flattering looked at him with the kind of respect that is mostly patience. Brynden Blackfish did not change at all, which made him the most reliable of them. The Freys held their bridge and counted the world in chickens while it went past. Walder muttered and mated his offspring like a man laying out a game he himself did not understand. Roose Bolton kept to the shadows where his voice sounded kind and his eyes looked like a child's doll's, flat and whatever color the room insisted on. Robb did not trust him because Ned Stark would not have trusted him, and that was the sort of inherited wisdom the North considered more valuable than most jewels. Sansa discovered that a lady can do a great many things that are not written anywhere in any book. She could count loaves and guess which baker had stolen. She could sit in a corner while men argued and see which of them would become better or worse if given the smallest piece of power. She could take a child into her lap whose cheek was patchy with winter rash and sing to it a song she had learned at a different breast and watch the mother's face smooth by inches. She walked in the gods' wood every day and let the cold peel her like a fruit and decided there was less inside to hurt than there had been once. When a raven came with a letter that bore the crabbed hand of the Queen of Thorns, the corners of Sansa's mouth moved and then stilled. Lady Olenna proposed a visit when the roads were clear. They would talk, she said, as women do when men tire them. Sansa folded the parchment and set it near the fire and said nothing of it to anyone until the moment was a good one and the persons likely to answer were not arguing with their own tempers. Tyrion went home and came back and went home again and learned to travel as a man travels to a worksite rather than a feast. At Casterly Rock, he found the old rooms changed by small increments, as if a ghost had been impatient and moved chairs an inch each night out of a need to prove itself. He slept in a bed where he had dreamed as a child of being tall. He woke from a dream of being small and laughed and then did not laugh. He took audiences under the rock's ribs and told men no in a manner they would be able to repeat later in their own halls without losing face. He drank with Bronn and listened gratefully to the way the Sellsword said things other men were afraid to think aloud. "Have you thought of marrying?" Bronn asked once, not sly, merely curious. He had a wife now, plain and sharp, who kept a holdfast and was unbothered by men who had killed more men than they had loved. "I married once," Tyrion said. The words slid out in the dry manner a man uses to make pain manageable. "It was a farce and a kindness and a cage." "You liked the girl," Bronn said. "I like the person she is becoming," Tyrion said. "I will not ruin that with some ceremony designed to protect a man's pride." "You could marry someone else," Bronn said. They make them everyday women. They do, Tyrion said. Most of them deserve a man who does not look over their shoulder at a shadow with his own hand around its throat. Bronn grunted. You should at least get some sons into something. It helps a man dig when there's someone to inherit the whole. I have an entire kingdom of orphans to spend my sentiment on, Tyrion said. They eat less. I doubt that, Bronn said. When the first real catastrophe of the winter hit, it did not come with ice and blue eyes, but with something smaller and more indiscriminate. A fever out of the east that rode in the bellies of rats and the teeth of fleas. It walked King's Landing like a tax collector with a strict sense of its own rights. The city has always been good soil for anything that eats men and grows quickly. Pylus died, careful and worried to the last. A boy Tyrion had bribed for information at a baker's door once died with his hand closed around a crust he had not had the strength to raise to his mouth. The bells tolled until the men at the ropes fainted, and then boys took their place and told in their place and learned early how work imitates sorrow. Tyrion found himself in the strange position of arguing for the use of wildfire not to burn men, but to burn the bedding where the fleas bit. The alchemist's guild preened. The High Septon frowned and then signed himself and did not forbid what worked. Fires burned in alleys. The city stank of soap in places that had not seen soap since Aegon's last dragon died. Davos walked south to north with a handkerchief over his mouth and spoke to men through the cloth, and they heard him still. Garland Tyrell opened Highgarden stores and did not make a speech. It was not heroism, but it was what there was. In the north, different fires burned. Black brothers and free folk stood together upon drifts that creaked under their boots and learned to judge a man by the way he held a shield against the wind rather than by the cut of his cloak. Jon wrote letters to Stannis and Tyrion both, and in both letters the words were thinner, not because there was less in him, but because there was less to be had of ink and food and warmth. There were nights when songs were sung and men laughed because the alternative frightened them more. There were mornings when the laughter had frozen on their teeth. Melisandre stood on the wall and searched the dark with her eyes as if it contained both the worst thing and the best thing she had ever wanted. Shireen read to the men, and her voice was a little bell that rang where no bell had ever rung right. Word came of battles that were not battles in the old manner. There is no glory in stabbing an arm of ice that is not a man's with an obsidian knife until it shatters, only necessity. Stannis went out once with a small party and came back with fewer than he had left with. He did not speak of it. He had never been a man who thought speaking made a thing better. He spoke, instead, of rations and numbers and the kind of men who survive winter long enough to see the use of spring. Davos wrote to Tyrion and said only, "We will require more." He did not say of what. Tyrion sent everything that could be paid for without starving the West. Wood and wool and wine that might as well be warm blood when used correctly. He sent words also, telling men who had never seen the wall why it mattered that it remained tall. It was during that long jaw of cold that a letter found him from the east with the slant barley-fair script of a woman who had taught herself to write as well as she had taught herself to rule. Daenerys Targaryen requested an audience with any Westerosi lord who could speak for the realm with honesty. She had freed cities that did not know what freedom was supposed to taste like and had learned that men will eat that food differently when it is given than when they have ground the grain themselves. She wished to understand the seasons in the land where she had been born not to be born. She wished to understand the thing with blue eyes that her old Maggie would have called a curse out of the past and an omen for the future. She was sending a ship with a white sail. She did not promise to come herself. She is wise, Davos said. She has learned to be, Tyrion said. I do not know whether that makes her more or less dangerous. You might, Davos said. If you met her, I might fall in love, Tyrion said dryly. The condition is not fatal, but it complicates numbers. She has dragons, Davos said, as if that were as matter of fact a part of the conversation as bacon. I have never found dragons to be a number one can balance, Tyrion said, and looked out toward the river where the ice's edge was crawling backward very slowly. The ship that came under the white sail brought a man with a bruised face and a careful way of standing, as if his body were either an instrument he had learned late or a burden he had carried too long. Ser Jorah Mormont. He had been exiled for selling men like sheep. He had found himself again, or so his account would have them believe, at a girl's side in deserts and palaces. He was very polite. He had the sadness of men who have told themselves the truth enough times that it has become a prayer rather than a story. She would be a better queen than most, Yora said simply, in a chamber where the fire struggled because the damp had been invited to stay and would not leave. Most, Tyrion repeated. Such a generous measure. She would not let a city starve because it had insulted her, Yora said, and for a moment it was not Daenerys he was defending but some deep need in himself to believe that the person he had kept faith with was not merely a dream that had not yet tired him out. She would not let a city starve because starving cities are more expensive than fed ones, Tyrion said. That makes her a ruler. It may even make her good. Are you mocking me? Yora asked wearily. I am measuring, Tyrion said, and I am telling you that if she comes, she will not find a realm that wants a queen. She will find a realm that wants bread and peace and the cold ended. If she brings dragons, they will cheer and then complain when the dragon's shadows frighten their chickens. I will tell her this myself if she wishes to hear it in a more graceful voice. I will tell her also that the wall is the crown she must win if she wishes to style herself protector of the realm. There is no iron chair that will matter very much if the thing beyond the trees comes all the way down to the river. Yora regarded him a long moment and then, perhaps painfully, smiled. I will tell her you are honest, he said. Tell her I am useful, Tyrion said. Honest men die faster. Useful men get given chairs at tables they do not like. When Yora had gone and the chamber was empty save for the smell of his cloak and the ash in the fire, Varys oozed through the door with his particular talent for appearing only in the absence of necessity. You did not ask my counsel, he said lightly. I thought I might like to hear what my own sounded like, Tyrion said. You will be asked to go to Meereen, Varys said. By whom? Tyrion asked. By circumstance, Varys said with a flutter of his hands. By a king who does not like to meet strangers and a lord who knows how he will be lied to before the liar has finished breathing in for the first time. By a woman who serves a flame that eats more than it warms. By a boy who sees the world as it is and requires a man who sees it as it might be to stand near him and remind him, from time to time, not to trip. I cannot, Tyrion said softly, and surprised himself with the urge he felt to say yes to the idea of leaving. There is work. There is, Varys said. There will always be. You do not like dragons? I like accounts that balance, Tyrion said. I will not leave Davos to do sums with men who cut meat better than figures. Let the girl come. If she is wise, she will send gifts and wait for winter to show her where to put her feet. She is not a girl, Varys said gently. She is a woman. And winter is coming to show us all something we do not wish to see. The court had altered since the first time Tyrion had walked its ways under a different king. The air was less perfumed. There was less laughter. Fewer songs. There was more bread. The gold cloaks looked less like wolves that had forgotten their pack and more like dogs that had learned to sit. In the mother house on Visenya's hill, a woman with clipped hair and a face that had learned to reveal nothing swept corridors and thought of a green place where grapes looked like children's toys. In Old Town, a boy named Tommen learned high Valyrian declensions and cried once at night where no one would hear because he had dreamed of kittens. In Sunspear, Myrcella learned the art of losing gracefully and winning in a way that made loss affordable to the other party. She wrote to Sansa once, an odd letter full of weather and oranges, and Sansa wrote back, and the letters made a bridge that no lord had thought to build and none could later dismantle without looking a fool. Jaime sent reports from the Stormlands that were bald and brief and more decent than anyone had expected. He turned men out of castles who had used storm and isolation as excuses for cruelty. He took supper with small folk now and then, reluctantly and with an expression that said he found the food edible and the conversation unpleasant and therefore knew he had obligations. There were skirmishes with men who had decided that winter was a good time to become kings of their own hall. He bled and bled others and did not make a speech over any part of it. Sometimes at night he looked at his hand, whole and handsome, and then at his sword, and felt a shame he did not entirely understand. He cursed Cersei less than he had. He thought of her more. Once, On a day blown thin with cold and miraculously clean light, Tyrion and Sansa walked the rock's higher ways and looked at the sea. The wind plucked her hood back, and her hair went like a banner, and she held it with one hand and laughed. He had not heard that laugh in some years without it breaking its sound against something sour in him. It did not break that day. It carried. She looked at him, and there was no pity in her look, only a curious fondness, like a woman eyeing a tool that has done her good service longer than any smith could have promised. "You are getting older," she said, and the insolence made him smile. "So are you," he said. "It improves you." "I wish I could return the compliment," she said, and then, when his face altered, touched his sleeve briefly. "Ido, I think you are improving for other people. That is the better compliment. Other people like their improvements unsubtle," he said. "I have never been tall." "You have learned where to stand," she said. A raven from the wall arrived sheen-frosted and refused to give up its message until it had been warmed and fed. Jon's words were confident in a way that had nothing to do with swagger. Stannis had held a line at a place named only by a stream and a spur of rock and lost 50 men to save 100. A boy named Gren had died at a gate made of trees and stood and held a giant down with the weight of his own small life. Melisandre had not burned anyone for a fortnight. Shireen had learned to knit. "Tell him there will be wool enough if she botches her first 4 scarves," Tyrion said to the scribe, and the scribe smiled without permission and wrote. In a winter that lasted longer than men liked to remember afterward, Daenerys Targaryen came at last, not with armies, not with flies in her wake as stories had promised, but quiet as snow on a thatch. Her ships came into Blackwater Bay under white sails as promised. The dragons flew high because it was easier than arguing with archers who pointed and forgot their orders when fear unlatched their fingers. Stannis received her as a queen receives a queen when kings are not eager to multiply themselves. They stood in the square and looked at one another, and the city understood in the manner of cities that something interesting and practical was occurring. Davos bowed. Melisandre stared. The High Septon made a small shape with his fingers on his chest and did not say what it meant even to himself. Tyrion had imagined he would feel something dramatic, the weight of history, the sense that a chapter had turned and someone had written in a new hand. He felt instead the familiar itch that comes before a long column of figures. She was younger than he had expected and older, both at once. She carried herself like a banner does when wind does not entirely favor it, compensating by the angle of the pole. Her eyes took everyone in and judged and did not openly condemn. When she looked at him, there was no surprise at his size. That was new. People either hid their surprise or flaunted it. She did neither. She had learned he existed and had worked him into the shape of her world. And when she reached him, he fit. "You," she said, "they say you kept a city that had forgotten how to be fed from eating itself entirely." "They say a great many things," Tyrion said. "Some of them are meals, some are poison. And you tell which is which," she said. "I do my best not to starve," Tyrion said. They walked the yard side by side because it was harder for a city to eavesdrop there. When men bowed, they did it for both, tested and then relieved of needing to decide. She asked questions about the wall with a hunger that suggested a need to be frightened properly. He answered in the same tone, which is to say the tone of a man presenting a bill, not the tone of a man telling a ghost story. "It will take more than dragons," he said finally when form had been satisfied. "Everything does," she said. "I thought once that one thing would take another as a key does a lock. I am learning to pick the tumblers in the dark without being certain I have the right door." "Do you intend to sit the Iron Throne?" Tyrion asked, because to pretend the question was not the question would have been impolite. "I intend to keep the people under it alive," she said. "If you can do that and give the chair to a fisherman with clean hands, I will not fight him for it. But I do not think I have met that fisherman." "You are more of a queen for saying so," Tyrion said, and found he meant it. She laughed then, not like Sansa, not like anyone he had ever met, a sound with salt in it. "You will advise me," she said. It was not a question. "I will advise the realm," Tyrion said, which was not an answer and not quite a refusal. She did not take offense. "That is all I asked," she said. And that was true enough that he felt the small knock of recognition behind his breastbone that comes when two people have said something new to each other and meant it. Not everyone took her presence with grace. Mace Tyrell sulked with a blandness he had perfected at feast tables. Olenna pricked her thumb on a needle and made a face and spoke to Sansa of Gardens in a tone that promised nothing but exchange of recipes and delivered the shape of an alliance 3 moves ahead. The High Septon preached a sermon about humility that was widely taken to be against women with hair. Melisandre stood at the edge of a circle of men and stared up at a dragon with love so naked in it that Tyrion looked away out of politeness. Stannis kept to his work. He had never been good with the presence of anything that might be counted more dramatic than himself. Winter did not end because a dragon flew over a city. It did not end because a woman came to talk. It would end when it would, and men would break or bend until it chose to release them. In the meantime, there were councils that lasted long enough to sour milk and women who sewed until their eyes watered and boys who learned to hold spears without stabbing their own feet. There were men who cheated at cards and then at grain metrics and were found out and punished. There were lists with more names crossed out than entered. There were maps with little pins that moved slower and slower and then started, tentatively, to move in the other direction. On a night when frost had crept back from the eaves a finger's width and a raven winged in with its feathers not quite crusted all the way to the quills, a letter came from Jon. The words were so tired he might have fallen asleep on them. "We have seen fewer now for a fortnight," he wrote. "The free folk have learned to hope. I am learning to be the sort of man men can hope at without hating themselves. Send nothing if you cannot send more than I can eat, and if you can send only one thing, send a story that ends with spring." Tyrion sat with it in the quiet and discovered that the urge to cry had fled him years ago when it might have been useful. He wrote back instead of weeping. An old Reach shepherd's tale about a lamb who wore a wolf's shadow to frighten the crows into leaving the field, and how the lamb learned afterward to be less foolish without learning to be more afraid. He sent with it a list of numbers that meant axes and wool and men, and a note to Davos that said simply, "We are getting to the bottom of the barrel." He underlined it. Then he wrote a private word to Daenerys that began, "If you mean to be more than the last king with a better story," and went on at a length he had not thought himself capable of until it was done. In the mother house, Cersei learned to fold cloth. It is a small thing, folding, but it makes the world smoother if done correctly. The sisters let her hands do simple penance until her heart stopped trying to maim itself with pride every afternoon. She thought of Jaime more than she thought of Tyrion now, which was some small mercy to someone, and less to someone else. Once, she looked up and found Myrcella standing in the doorway, taller and with a face set like a cup on a tray, balanced and capable. They spoke of nothing that mattered and then, for a moment, everything that did. Afterward, Cersei lay awake for many hours looking at the rafters and thinking that she had once had a choice to be less like the father she had liked to pretend she did not resemble. She could not remember the moment. It had been lost among other, smaller moments folded wrong. Jaime rode north to deliver orders because ravens froze and men got lost. He was stopped on a narrow road by bandits who did not know the shape of the man they had stopped and learned it, and one of them lived to tell others to stop less. He came to a bridge where a woman taller than any woman had a right to be stood with a harp slung over her shoulder and a sword strapped on her back. Brienne did not play. She spoke. "Lady Sansa is safe," she said simply. He nodded as if this were a ledger entry and rode on, because some words, once heard, settle cleanly and need no commentary. Daenerys went north before spring. It was madness and sense both, and men argued about which outnumbered the other until the arguments froze and fell to the ground like sleet. She went not to the wall but to Winterfell, because the north would not carry its wagons that far, and because dragons like roofs more than open snow when it is full winter. Her dragons set the sky above the gods would alight with color that was not flame but might as well have been. The old heart tree did not bow. Nothing in the north bowed when it had not decided to. Sansa stood before Daenerys and did not kneel and did not curtsy and did not insult. They spoke about the price of grain in a true winter and the ways men dislike being told how to warm their babies by women who have never been cold. They spoke of dragons as if speaking of plows. Daenerys met Arya in a corridor when no one had expected Arya to be in that corridor. least of all Arya. The girl had come home with a new face that was the old one made sharper, and a little laugh that said she was aware of the joke of her own survival. They did not speak long. Arya liked a queen more than Arya liked most people. She liked that Daenerys watched without pretending to be looking elsewhere. Tyrion saw them all together once in the great hall with its banners gone a little dull from the breath of men and the smoke of fires. Starks and a Targaryen and a Lannister and a smuggler and a woman from a god with too many names and a knight who had once been a king's guard for a king he had killed. He felt absurdly, for a heartbeat, as if he stood inside a story told to frighten children into eating their greens. He put the feeling aside as he always did. He reached instead for the figures and their sensible comfort. "Here," he said, tapping with one nail where the map laid on the table said the night fort brood over its own ghosts. "And here, where the road between Mole's Town and the King's Road turns ugly with drifts. And here at Long Lake. If they mean to test us where we think we are strong, they will come where our lines are stretched. The Rankin Law." He realized he had made it up and named it after a cooper in Lannisport who had once balanced barrels in a way that amazed him and smiled at the gall of baptizing wisdom with a poor man's name, as if that made it both more noble and less suspect. "You speak as if they obey laws," Stannis said, narrowing his eyes as if he could will the numbers to tell him more than they wanted to. "Everything obeys a law," Tyrion said. "The trick is learning which law applies while it can still be applied." Jon was at the table too, and his mouth did that small, rare thing it did when humor came, and he let it stand. "We will not be clever and be eaten in a clever fashion," he said. "We will be dull and live." "I have been trying to live dull for years," Tyrion said. "It rarely takes." "Our dragons," Daenerys began and then stopped. She had learned in Meereen what good men learn in hard places, that to say our and not mean my where dragons are concerned is the first proof that someone might have learned anything at all. "My dragons," she corrected gently, "will do what they can farther north if the wind lets them. If it does not, they will do what they can where the wind lets them not." "They are not horns you can blow and call the dead to run," Melisandre said, and for the first time in a long time there was no heat in her voice, only the sort of cold that can be useful if men do not try to warm themselves by it. "They set in motion as much as the gods, who do not often notice men unless men are shouting, would allow." Tyrion wrote to Old Town for more ravens and more men to train them. He wrote to the Riverlands for oats. He wrote to Dorne and asked, politely, if the sun might share some of its heat with men who had none. Doran obliged in a leisurely fashion that nonetheless saw wagons moving sooner than anyone else could have gotten them moving. He wrote to the Westerlands and used his own name like a weight and remembered what it had been like to be a boy with his face pressed to a door to hear if the voices on the other side were saying anything that might save him. He received a letter in return one morning in a hand he did not recognize, but whose first line told him who had taught it. It read, "The kittens have had kittens. Tommen." He sat very still with that for a long time and then smiled until the corner of his mouth hurt. He carried the letter with him that day to every meeting and did not take it out once and did not need to. Some things a man can carry entirely inside his ribs. The great battle that men later named without agreeing on a name, a thing of snow and steel and heat and breath, does not belong to Tyrion's tale to narrate. He was not at the wall of trees where giants broke and breaking lived long enough to throw their breakers to the ground. He was not on the ridge of shale where a dragon's flame laid glass over ice and made a mirror in which men saw themselves and wanted to be better. He was not at the place where a boy named Dolorous Ed made a joke and then a choice and only one was remembered. He was in King's Landing counting bodies to make certain the city buried them in the right order, which is the least glorious work and what keeps men from becoming worse than dead. He knew when it had turned because the ravens stopped going north and began coming south with words that did not taste like desperation. He knew when it had ended because a letter came from Davos that contained no request and only this: "We would have died without you." The "you" was plural, backward-reaching and forward-pointing, and he pretended not to understand and allowed himself 5 minutes in his chamber to drink good wine and imagine that he had placed a stone on a scale and tipped it. The spring that came was not jubilant. It was grudging. It crept the way an old cat creeps back to a hearth it has been locked out from. The city ran less. The West's minds found their rhythm again in a different seam, as if a woman who had been unkind had been coaxed with a better song. The Reach sowed and counted. The North breathed more deeply once men had stopped holding their breath, thinking it would keep the cold from filling their lungs. There were births. There were marriages of convenience and two of love. One of those was Sansa's, to a man whose name the songs never found interesting enough to learn well. He was kind and serious and did not bother her. He had a mind for building and a respect for quiet. Tyrion approved in the manner of a father who knows he has no right to approve but has been granted the courtesy anyway. He sent a silver sewing needle-carved plane and an apology no one read aloud. Cersei remained in her house. She did not swear further. She learned nothing more and nothing less. Sometimes she remembered boys with bows and men who taught those boys to sting and regretted nothing for an hour. That was the scale of her salvation. It was not much. It was hers. Jaime died in the Stormlands not far from a tree that a farmer swore had once thrown shade upon Robert Baratheon's drunken backside. He fell with his sword in his hand fighting men who had decided that peace was a poor diet. He died surrounded by soldiers who had learned, to their surprise, that they had liked him. He died without having made peace with his own legacy or having found a word to replace Kingslayer, and grew annoyed at the gods for not arranging that small courtesy, and then stopped being annoyed because he stopped being. Brienne brought his sword to King's Landing with a face like a smith's and did not cry until she was alone, and did not tell anyone afterward that she had done even that much. Daenerys did not sit the Iron Throne. She sat other chairs, sometimes in Winterfell, sometimes in King's Landing, sometimes in a tent that smelled of horses and women's hair and ink. She learned to share a map with men whose fingers did not always point where hers did, and to forgive it. She grew older. Her dragons grew magnificent, and then, in the manner of things that are too bright, learned to be less flamboyant before men could force them to it. One died over the sea in a storm that did not care it was killing nonsense and myth both. The other two sired infants men named without shame and less sense. Stannis died eventually, as men do, in a bed with a ledger and the latest tally of the city's stores within reach of a hand that had learned more mercy from scarcity than any priest could have taught. He did not leave a speech or a poem. He left Davos alive and the law stronger than it had been and little else. Davos wept in a room where no one saw and wrote a list of the things that had to be done and went and did them. That is a way of saying a prayer. It was his. Tyrion grew old also. He did not grow wiser in the ways that men like to count, because he had been wise enough to get by early, and the wisdom he added was mostly a sort of patient tenderness for others' failures that he never thought to cultivate in himself. He learned when to leave a room. He learned when to stay. He learned that laughter applied in small doses at the right moment cures more ills than speeches, and that numbers written clearly will get a man farther than any banner if the line that matters is the one that ends in bread. He stood one day on a balcony that gave him a ridiculous view of a city that had tried to kill him thrice and failed, and he watched men carry oranges into the square and slice them and hand them to children, and those children sucked them as if sweetness were a brand new right that had been bestowed without condition. He had a small bottle in a locked drawer somewhere, empty of everything but its own memory and his guilt, and he kept it as a man keeps a poem he cannot read because it is in a tongue he has never learned. He did not visit it often. He did not need to. It came to him as it wished and left when it had done with him. On the day, a letter came from the wall that said only, in Jon's hand, "We have burned the last body for a while now and may begin building again." Tyrion went to the sea. He went alone. He climbed down a path goats might have scoffed at and stood with his boots in a froth that had come a long way to lick leather. He said names, not to the water as supplication, but to the air as if putting them there loosened them from his lungs. Tisha, Tywin, Catelyn, Sansa, Shireen, Davos, Jon, Jaime, Cersei, Shae, Gren, a man he had killed whose eyes had been as mild as a bridegroom's, a boy who had brought wine, a foreman who had finally learned to prop a shaft so that it would not fall. He said his own name last. He did not ask forgiveness. He did not think he could pronounce the words correctly if he tried. When he turned, the sun was lower than he had meant to let it be. The path up was steep. He took it one measured step at a time, as he had taken most of the last quarter of his life. He did not look up at the top to tempt it to pretend to recede. He did not look back for drama. He climbed. Somewhere behind him, out beyond the horizon, a dragon's shadow moved over blue water like a hand smoothing the ripples of cloth, and out beyond that, uncountable miles, there was a city he had never seen that nonetheless had eaten his name in its rumors and belched. The air smelled like salt and stone and oranges and ash. He put his hand to the rock when his foot slipped, and the rock held him, and he kept going.